Firstly, thank you everyone for attending besides Tirana. I highly appreciate your presence, and I'm confident that by the end of this presentation you'll gain some more insights on the main topic of this presentation, which will cover 0 days, their impact, and the implications for the vendor of that product. So the outline of the presentation will be as follows. It will start with a short biography of the presenter. Then we are going to talk about what are 0 days, and how a 0 day can become an end day. And then we are going to talk about how to choose your target when hunting for 0 days, how to build your methodology when hunting for them, and then we're going to discuss if this specific vulnerability can be exploited in the wild, which is the key point that will determine the impact of the vulnerability and the potential implications for that product. And then we're going to dive on the proper reporting for these kind of vulnerabilities. And then lastly, I'm going to share some of the CVs that Sentry team has identified. So starting with a short biography, I am Armend Gashi, a managing security consultant at Sentry, and on my daily basis I'm responsible for breaking stuff. And these kind of stuff include web applications, APIs, mobile applications, infrastructures, external infrastructures, internal and cloud ones. And apart from the technical part, I also lead a team of security consultants where my main duty and responsibility is the professional growth of my team. And I've been part of Sentry for more than 3 years now. And throughout this time, I've had the opportunity to contribute as an instructor at Cyber Academy. Some of my certification achievements include the ones issued by Cyber Academy, and they are CACP, CAC, and CACI. And on my free time, I enjoy offensive security researching, swimming, and some heavy metal music, especially if that's some Lamb of God. Prior to kicking off into details, every information shared throughout this presentation is meant to serve for educational purpose only, and the presenter will not take any kind of accountability or responsibility for any misuse of this information. Starting off with 0 days. 0 days are security vulnerabilities, but these kind of vulnerabilities are more unique rather than the ones that are not 0 days due to the potential impact that they might have if such attack were to happen. And the term 0 day stands for the 0 day of defense towards that vulnerability, meaning that the vendor or the developer had 0 days of remediation towards that vulnerability. And to be more familiar with 0 days, we've got to understand 3 terminologies. And they are the 0 day vulnerability, 0 day exploit, and 0 day attack. So with 0 day vulnerability, we mean the actual flaw, or the piece of code that makes the application to be vulnerable. Whereas the 0 day exploit is another piece of code that takes advantage of the vulnerability. And with the 0 day attack, we mean the actual cyber attack that utilizes the exploit in order to exploit the actual flaw. And in order to conduct a 0 day attack, attackers must have a target. And you might wonder who can be a target of 0 days. And that includes literally everyone, including us, including individuals of high interest, military organizations, government agencies, organizations, NGOs, and so on. And in most of the cases, when we hear about 0 days, we mean some critical vulnerabilities, which in most of the cases is an RCE. But what if this RCE gets exposed in the public? It means that that 0 day is not a 0 day anymore. And that vulnerability becomes an end day. And the key differences between 0 days and end days is shared throughout this meme. And the difference between 0 days and end days is that end days have an available patch. And the N in the end days stands for the number of days since that vulnerability has been addressed. And some of the potential risks that end days can have is that if you don't update your device, meaning that everyone who has that specific end day exploit, they can still take advantage of that vulnerability and you can still get exploited. Then, in the next slide, we're going to talk on how you can build your, how you can choose your target. And frankly speaking, prior to choosing the target, you gotta be very honest with yourself, and you gotta be aware of your own skill set. And if you don't have the sufficient skill set, brace yourself to learn and then start hunting for 0 days. And after you build this skill set, you first gotta research the industry, whether that industry is financial industry or file sharing or collaboration platforms and so on. And after you identify the industry, which in case is a collaboration platform, you gotta research the providers. What kind of providers offer that solution? And in the next step, you gotta be careful what you pick. And you don't want to be a vanilla ice cream, and that means of choosing the default product that every other researcher attempts to find vulnerabilities. And this is important because you gotta identify a specific product that it is used a lot in the wild, but yet not a lot of people have heard of it a lot. And one of the bonus points that I also take care a lot to look at is if that application is complex. And the reason why I try to care if that application is complex is due to the functionalities that that application might offer. And if an application offers more functionalities, it means that the attacking surface can grow way longer. And of course, if that application has the source code, it has a bonus point in me. And one of the applications that had all of these checks back at the time when me and my team were conducting a research was Nextcloud. And Nextcloud is an application that is open source, and it also serves as a file sharing platform and a collaboration platform. And back at the time, while me and my team were researching this application, we took a look at the security advisories that were published back then, the existing vulnerabilities, and back at the time, Nextcloud didn't have critical or high issues such as RC for more than 2 or 3 years. And what could be the potential impact if an RC could occur in Nextcloud? I mean, who would care if an RC exists in Nextcloud, which is the key point that would determine the real impact of high and critical issues. And in the next step, what you want to do is build your own methodology. And of course, you gotta trust the process. Don't attempt to find the default vulnerabilities or some low-hanging fruits, because they can be automated. And how I automate them is by using my personalized nuclei templates, and then I run nuclei with the default and my personalized templates, and then start for hunting for low-hanging fruits if they can occur. But I don't focus my research on hunting for low-hanging fruits. And what I also try to do is to be persistent on one application and try to find the undocumented stuff in that application. And if none of this is working, you gotta go back to the roots. But what if, let's say you find a cool vulnerability that its impact is high, but not as high as this cat? I mean, what you wanna do? Then, in the next step, maybe you want to consider introducing yourself to complex exploit chains. And with complex exploit chains, we mean chaining 2 or 3 vulnerabilities together to perform one action, which is exactly what we did back at the time in Nextcloud. And one of the cases where complex exploit chains you can think of is the browser exploit. I mean, what if you have a sort of code execution in the browser, but that code execution remains in the sandbox system of the browser? It means that you gotta chain it with another vulnerability to escape its sandbox, to write an arbitrary file, and then to achieve code execution. And with complex exploit chains, me and my team were successful on identifying this CVE. And using this vulnerability, we were able to induce our Nextcloud instance to send arbitrary HTTP requests to an arbitrary server. And this was possible by manipulating this parameter here, which was the URIX. And then what Nextcloud tried to do was try to load this file, which is the file name parameter, try to load this file within these instance. And what me and my team tried to do back at the time was set up web server and then try to identify whether that application is communicating with us. And then it ended up that the application was vulnerable to server-side request forgery. But this SSRF was not your typical SSRF that allows you to extract AWS metadata or maybe access locally hosted interfaces on port 8080, because this vulnerability was an account takeover. And how we did account takeover is by setting up a fake web dev interface in our locally hosted web server, and then induce the application to send an arbitrary HTTP request to us. But to perform that, we had to bypass the URL validation in Nextcloud, which was successful, and then we got an account takeover where the application sent the administrative credentials through the basic authorization header. Next, what me and my team did back at the time was investigate more on Nextcloud. I mean, yeah, we had an account takeover, but it's a cool vulnerability, but it's not critical yet. Even though that it didn't require any sort of user interaction, it was still a high severity vulnerability. So what we decided to do was conduct some more research until we inspected this specific HTTP request. And what this HTTP request did was to call an arbitrary HTTP class, which is used to perform an action. But to perform that action, there's got to be a check or a condition. And the condition that was specified was check if a file, when gets created, check if that file name is rc.txt. And if it is not rc.txt, perform an action that uses this style command, and then analyze the style written within this file, and then append the output towards another file. And what me and my team did was create a legit condition, and then in the operation parameter, we induced the Nextcloud instance to execute the curl command, and as the query parameter, execute the UMI command and send the output back to our server, which was a code execution vulnerability. Also, that this vulnerability was an RC, it was still not high enough. And the reason why it was not high enough is because the vulnerability required administrative permissions. Hence, we had to do some more research and then chain this vulnerability with another attacking vector so that we can induce this sort of vulnerability to be exploitable by the least privileged user in Nextcloud instances. And the beauty of it is that numerous Nextcloud instances have default registration, which means it's still sort of zero-click RC and zero-click account takeover. Two vulnerabilities and cool vulnerabilities, but who cares? And to determine it, me and the team had to do some more research to determine whether these vulnerabilities can be exploited in the wild. And to determine it, firstly, we used Shodan, which is a search engine, and in Shodan we identified at around 6,000 Nextcloud instances, which means these Nextcloud instances were vulnerable to account takeover and were vulnerable to code execution. And we also used the Google hacking database, also known as Google Dorking, and by using that we identified many, many more Nextcloud instances, and each one of them was vulnerable to code execution. And the most precious client of Nextcloud was Deutsche Telekom, which was identified by researching the blog posts of Nextcloud, and then we came to this article that they were presenting their collaboration to offer a product. And these vulnerabilities were so high and were so critical so that the German media was reporting on them, which directly indicated that these vulnerabilities are cool and these vulnerabilities could be exploited in the wild. The next step, of course, we have to report these vulnerabilities. And I've seen a lot of reports, write-ups, bug bounty reports, and I've seen the default mistakes that security researchers do. And the default mistake is that security researchers try to describe the whole vulnerability in one title, as in the vulnerability can be one-click account takeover through XSS and query parameter. I mean, if the parent vulnerability is XSS, you gotta name that vulnerability XSS. And in the next section, you gotta describe the issue and what induces the issue, as in a short summary to help the client understand their issue. And then in the impact, you gotta demonstrate what you did and what could be achieved by carrying out this specific attack. And in this section, it's highly important not to pretend and not to assume. And what I mean with pretend or assume, you cannot go like, hey, I have an XSS and I can perform account takeover. I mean, did you try to do the account takeover? If you didn't try, maybe you gotta craft a JavaScript code that carries out that specific action. And if that didn't happen, I mean, why you gotta assume or make it such big of a deal, hey, there's an XSS and attackers could do this and that. Did you do that? If not, try to do that. And of course, you gotta provide remediation assistance to the client and be as helpful as you can and use professional wording and avoid the hackerish words. And then these are some of the achievements of Team Sentry, where these two vulnerabilities that I've just presented were identified by me, by Armend and Dennis, and we also have two more CVs being published, and they are still in the process of remediation, so we cannot disclose them yet, and they are yet cooler vulnerabilities than these two that I've just presented. And then we have Adriatic Rotze, who is a lead software engineer at Sentry, and Adriatic had a very cool vulnerability in Safari that allowed him to perform a denial of service on each iPhone, which means that it was a 0 day until Adriatic reported that. And Adriatic also has another CVE, which is still reserved, and Apple is still in the process of remediation, so we cannot disclose it yet. And then we have two more sort of 0 days identified by Dren, and these two vulnerabilities are yet in Nextcloud. So I think that was it from me. Do you have any questions or any concerns? So that was it.